I'm Rena Hunter. I'm the Global Information Governance Manager at Latham & Watkins, and I'm presenting today with my colleague.
Yeah, I'm Craig MacDonald, the Senior Records Coordinator at Latham & Watkins.
And we're presenting on Rethinking IG in the digital age, which we hope will be very interesting for all of you. Obviously, the world is different than it used to be, even 3 years ago. So I start by just looking at what is IG. I'm sure a lot of you know this, at least from the law firm perspective. When we look at IG, it's really a whole host of things. We're looking at data security, data privacy, risk and compliance, and the world that we knew before is different. In one way, we try to scare our clients and even our own employees so they understand the gravity of what we do to some extent, but we no longer have to do that anymore because we see what just happened with Deloitte, what just happened with Equifax, and things just speak for themselves now, so it makes it a little bit easier. So when we look at rethinking things, a lot of times we need to retrain our staff. We need to rethink how we present material. For a lot of us, we have staff who have been in positions for the last 25 years, and they may have worked with paper a great deal, and so you have to explain and translate for them what is the equivalent in paper. We've definitely had people, and I've seen in other organizations, people have asked, so how do digital records apply to me? Because it hasn't been clear to them in the past. Why do I need to understand these different electronic repositories? And so one thing I would recommend doing is translating for everyone who has a role in a records department or managing information generally. So I've just put an example here, but if someone used to handle things in folders and drawers, or information on a shelf, well, maybe that's your network drive. Or if you used to handle paper that was that was just a correspondence file, maybe now that's in your mailbox or your document management system. But translating, how does the job still apply, but in a different way?
And that's really important because, as we all know, we have so much digital information now in our organizations. And I think we all were at the last keynote with David Brown of the SEC, who mentioned they have over 900,000 terabytes just in their shared drives. And so we actually have a similar slide that discusses, 1 terabyte of data is about 60 piles of stacked printed out paper as tall as the Eiffel Tower. And if you're, let's say, at a large organization and you have 600 terabytes, that's about 20 million boxes of paper. So think about maybe how many boxes of paper your organizations have just today and how that probably dwarfs what you have. That's also 36,000 stacks of paper as tall as the Eiffel Tower. Now, I was looking, being in Providence, it's my first time in Providence, and it's a great city. The tallest building in Providence is half the size of the Eiffel Tower. So if you're walking around this week, that would be like 70,000 stacks of paper as tall as the tallest building in Providence in terms of possible data within organizations. And so Rena and I, we're from law firms. So Legal Management Magazine recently published a study that said 57% of printed out paper that is formally filed to the RMS, Records Management System, at firms is actually just duplicates or printouts from the document management system. So why are we saving that information? And that's just what's formally filed. If you have information that is in a secretary's desk or maybe an attorney's desk, that number grows by almost 40%. So again, really thinking what sort of information are we not only taking into our organizations, but printing out, where are we storing it? Going back to what Rena was talking about, knowing where to file things electronically is so important. And so securing information is also more important as we have more digital information. So we wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about encryption. It's probably a good idea to have an encryption policy within your organizations that enables you to, limit what sorts of data can be transmitted outside of your organization without encryption. So, and it also allows you to say, okay, these are the exceptions to our encryption policy. So for example, Rian and I work at law firms, and a lot of what we do is send information to government agencies and courts. So we might have exceptions in place for those organizations that have restrictions on what types of encryption they want.
And if I can just add, it is interesting that a lot of courts and government agencies don't allow us to encrypt. So I'll be interested to see how there's a shift in that over time.
Right, and related to that too is, if you're using vendors and you're requiring your vendors to encrypt in your outside counsel guidelines, or especially law firms, making sure that your staff has the ability to decrypt what you're receiving. That can be an issue sometimes too. So it's really a two-way street. You want to make sure that you're encrypting information leaving your organization that needs to be encrypted, especially if we're talking PII or PHI, and also thinking of possible jurisdictional requirements. But also that you're, thinking about when people are sending you information, are you asking them to encrypt it? So.
Yeah, we definitely see that big banks and medical institutions block software that would enable them to decrypt certain material or run certain executables, and meanwhile they ask us to encrypt their material, and then they receive it, and then they have a problem decrypting it. And so I do think that as we rethink IG, we will need to come up with better ways to transfer and secure information. And that leads us to cloud, the cloud. I don't think we all need to be scared of the cloud, but I do think that we should, employ a measured approach and understand appropriate times to use the cloud and do some sort of review. But just taking a step back within your organization, I think you should have some sort of cloud computing policy. At Latham, we have a cloud review board, and we examine all the materials that might be going into the cloud or cloud-hosted solutions. We do look at policies blocking access to personal email to prevent data leakage. I think that organizations should look at that if you have not already. If you read the terms and conditions, and I know we'll get to that later, but you do have to think about when you store something in your personal email account, who owns that and what they can do with it. A lot of big banks have been progressive, and they've already taken care of that, and some law firms have, but I think it's definitely worth exploring. Also blocking access to really any site where you might upload data. If you work at an organization where you have sensitive information, figuring out where your information is going and can go is extremely important. So I think you might want to look at what your social media policies are when it comes to not just what do you post on your Facebook account, but what can you upload to Facebook. Policies blocking access to download to media. If you can download material to media, is that encrypted media? Are you able to track what folks are downloading to media? Maybe something you'll want to look at based on the importance of the information that people have access to. That may come under the guise of employee monitoring if you're keeping track of what folks are downloading to media, but perhaps something you'll want to keep track of if it's appropriate. Limits on where data can be processed and stored, and taking risk into account. I think with data privacy, that will be an important issue. And what will you do if your data is unavailable? So if you are using a cloud-hosted solution and they have an issue, what is your plan? Do you have some sort of backup? So general ethics rules. So just as a quick summary, and one point that I think is interesting is when I started looking at the ethical rules, especially for lawyers, but in other organizations as well, what's interesting is with the advent of all of these wonderful tools that we have more access and the ability to share with more and more people. And yet, I read a paper that was discussing whether you should avoid the use of technology if you have particularly sensitive information about mergers and acquisitions, trade secrets, healthcare, banking, and defense. Now, that was targeted towards lawyers, but it almost seems like we've gotten so far with technology that now they're saying we should totally revert from it. And I will be curious to see how that impacts us going forward, because we all have that, or you know someone with that, crazy grandfather or great-grandfather who's, storing money under the bed, and that does seem somewhat crazy, but then you see things like Equifax, which just happened, and you wonder, well, how will we manage these issues, and what is the best way? And I don't think we've answered those questions yet. Cyber liability insurance. This is an interesting one. I think for all organizations where information is your asset, you should look into having some sort of cyber liability insurance. If you are a cloud-hosted solution or an e-discovery provider and you don't have it, you should. One really interesting point with and although it's my slide, I'll give Craig credit. He had pointed out to me that cyber liability insurance has actually been around for 20 years, which really surprised me. But there were some forward thinkers out there. I think we do talk about putting policies in place. I listened to someone who spoke about data privacy, an attorney, and she had mentioned that when you put policies in place, you definitely need to follow those, because regulators will come in, they'll want to see what you're doing, are you following your policies, but so will your insurance company. They insured you based on certain parameters. They're anticipating that you are following your policies, whether it's related to encryption or cloud computing or general security, and if you fall short, it may be the case that you may not be entirely insured, or you may not receive, you may be dropped from that carrier, and you may have a problem obtaining cyber liability insurance in the future. So ensuring that you are following the policies that you put in place is crucial.
And we just wanted to, again, talk about vendors. I know some of the other presentations have mentioned this topic as well. Just thinking about in terms of when you're coming to an agreement with a vendor to do a project or services, considering what they're actually going to be doing with your data in the long term. Don't just take an approach to look at what they're doing with that project. For example, if you are trying to reduce your paper storage and you're doing a digitization project and you use a vendor to do that, and let's say they scan 10,000 boxes for you, right? That's great, and you get these PDF files that you can search and you have them on your systems. That's great. How long are they storing your files for after they've given you your product? And, hopefully they use encryption to send it to you, but consider where that's going to be stored in their systems. How long? Are they using cloud storage? Just simple things like that can really be helpful. And I know one of the presentations mentioned earlier, it was a BDO, said that security breaches 15 years ago was a CD falling off a truck or something like that. And that still can happen, though. So when you are sending things to offsite storage in terms of removable media, make sure that you're encrypting that information and that you have the key to it, so that if you do have to recall those files 5 years down the road, somebody at your organization can still access them even if you've left. And if you're working with law firms or other vendors, consider what vendors they might be working with. Your fourth party. Where might your data be going? Are they going to send it to an e-discovery vendor? Is your data going to move to a jurisdiction that you're not necessarily aware of at that time? So really think, where is your data going to be when it's with your vendors?
And if you do have a cloud-hosted solution, when we talk about who holds the key, if you do encrypt data and you're using a cloud-hosted solution, you do want to hold the key. So I would just add that as kind of another perspective on that point.
And Rena kind of touched on this already, but just thinking of service providers and making sure that you're aware of the terms and conditions, especially people don't always necessarily, when they sign up for personal email, fully read through the terms and conditions. So you, in some situations, might be giving your service provider the right to use, reproduce, modify, publish, or distribute your content. And some service providers state that you're also giving their third parties that right as well. So I don't know my personal emails third parties, so that's something to consider. And I think we're all aware that some people do send email to and from work emails to their personal emails. This was obviously just recently in the news. In the White House, 6 people it came out that they're using personal email for certain things. So it is something to really talk to your employees about too, in terms of not just blocking these sites, but not using them for work purposes. Another couple processes that we wanted to discuss are the file intake, release, and destruction processes. In terms of file intake, one thing to really consider is how much information you're taking on. Especially if you're a law firm and you have new attorneys coming on, why are you taking in so much information that your firm necessarily won't be using? Is one thing to consider. And also, where are you going to put that information? How are you going to track it? How is it being sent to you? Again, we talked about encryption earlier. You definitely want to make sure that people who are sending you information are doing so in a secure fashion. And likewise, when you're doing file releases, consider what you're going to send back to clients. And one thing to actually consider about file intake is if a client sends you information, right, and you put it on your systems and they send you removable media, well, why hold on to that removable media for another 5, 10, 20 years? Why not return that disk to them or flash drive to them at that point in time? In terms of file releases, another important tip might be talking with employees about outbound email security. I think there's a lot of people think, oh, it's my work email. It's more secure than my personal email. Well, as we all know that, unless there's TLS in place, if you send an email from work to another email address in transit, there's possible threats. So making sure that people aren't just sending documents over email that necessarily shouldn't be sent without some sort of protection.
And just to add to that, for those of you who aren't familiar with the reference that was just made, essentially just sending in a basic way, I guess, through a secure tunnel between 2 domains. So, between @Coca-Cola, everyone who has an email address of @Coca-Cola.com and everyone who has an email address of @Pepsi.com, if they were emailing each other, just making sure that every email back and forth between those domains is secure. And that's something great to have with clients to set up in advance, so that way folks can't things can't go awry. But a lot of companies have one-off, the ability to do that on a one-off basis, but you might want to set something up in advance so everything's secure going back and forth with key clients.
Yeah, and just real quickly on destruction, if you are making agreements with other organizations that you're going to destroy data at a certain point, make sure you're giving forethought to what you're actually going to destroy before entering those agreements, and think about who at your organization is going to be destroying information. For example, you don't want to attest that you've destroyed all copies of certain information that you received, and then have to go and delete things on like backup tapes. If you carve that out up front, you can really save yourselves a lot of time.
Unless, of course, you are the type of organization where you are now obligated, based on the data privacy rules, to delete certain information, but where you are a party to an organization that has the ability in some circumstances to manage what you are deleting and from what repositories, you certainly should consider looking at putting a policy in place or providing guidance. So we definitely need to get organized. As our keynote speaker from the SEC just discussed, they really need to organize their files. I've just put together a sample here of different repositories and some thoughts about how you might want to organize it. Definitely, there is a move towards a least privilege approach we have seen that in a lot of organizations, there has been pushback because everybody wants to have access to everyone, and they have this wonderful environment of sharing information, but it's just not the way that we operate anymore. It can't be the way that we operate anymore. We have to figure out who needs access to what, and if you need to have some sort of knowledge management system, then you should hire employees to handle knowledge management, but that doesn't mean everyone should have access to everything. So when I look at document management systems, it's not only moving towards a least privilege approach, but figuring out what is going there so you know exactly what to anticipate. So in a law firm, for example, I should know that in my document management system, I have email and I have documents. And those should be documents, for example, that the firm generates, or a Latham employee would send or receive, but I might not put client information there, for example. So that way, when the time comes and I receive a request, I know exactly where client information will be and where it will not be, and that can be a huge help. I think this applies, though, broadly to any organization. You can extrapolate. The same goes with email accounts. I don't think people should be commingling data. So if colleagues want to share information, there should be a repository where they share information. I don't think I should take a folder from one employee's email account and just drop it in another folder's email account, or take email from customers if you're collecting it for some reason and placing it in your own personal email account. Your personal email account should just be the emails that you send and receive, if possible. So I'm just going to move forward in the interest of time. I'm not sure how much time we have left. Pardon?
We're over time.
We're over time. So we're at a law firm. We enjoy talking. This is our thing. If you need to get up, feel free. So access and transfer of data. It's very important to know what jurisdictional restrictions or data transfer rules apply. It's interesting. I have seen that folks say, well, if I access through a remote system, then I'm not actually viewing the data in that jurisdiction. But I'm sitting here and I can see it, but it's really stored somewhere else. I will tell you that there is case law out there, at least in the US, and I don't know if it's in other jurisdictions, that says that you have brought that to the US. So we really need to rethink how we are using technology and how it impacts us, because a lot of people try to use workarounds and it's just not going to fly anymore. People are wise to it. They understand how technology works, and I think you have judges that are becoming more and more technical. So if you don't want data to go to the UK, for example, because you don't want to be subject to the Solicitors Regulation Authority or the Serious Fraud Office there, well, perhaps you might not want to access that data remotely if you're sitting in the UK, or you won't want to be subject to the DOJ subpoena power here. You might not want to access that data from the US, even if it's stored elsewhere on a server. But then you've got everything else. You've got the GDPR, ITAR, HIPAA. Since we're out of time, I won't go into this too much, but it's really important to understand where your data is stored, whether you need to regionalize, and who can access that data.